They were once the wives of Japan's most powerful men, living in privilege while their husbands led a nation to war. But when World War II ended, that privilege turned to fear. Hunger and shame replaced comfort, and behind closed doors, these women carried a hidden burden, the untold cost of their husbands' crimes. It started on August 15, 1945, when the people of Japan gathered around radios to hear something they had never experienced before. The voice of Emperor Hirohito came through the crackling speakers, announcing that Japan would surrender. For millions, this was a shock. The emperor was seen as almost divine, and most ordinary people had never heard him speak directly. His calm but distant words marked the end of a war that had brought destruction across Asia and left Japan in ruins. Just 2 weeks later, foreign troops began arriving on Japanese soil. American soldiers landed and spread across the country. At the center of it all was General Douglas MacArthur, who landed in Tokyo at the end of August. He was the man chosen to oversee Japan's surrender and rebuild the nation. By September 1945, the focus turned to responsibility for who had led Japan into such a devastating war, and who should answer for the millions of deaths across Asia and the Pacific. American authorities began rounding up the top political and military figures. One of the first ones was Hideki Tojo, the most recognizable Japanese leader during World War II. As Prime Minister, he approved the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, pulling the United States into the war. For many Americans, his face became the symbol of Japan's aggression. Posters and newspapers often showed his stern expression, making him the enemy in the eyes of millions. But behind this public figure stood his wife, Katsuko Tojo, a woman who would carry the weight of his choices long after the war ended. Katsuko had lived in their family home in Setagaya, Tokyo during the war years. She was a mother to their children, running the household as Tojo's responsibilities grew heavier. But when Japan surrendered, everything changed. The Allies made it clear that Tojo would be arrested as a war criminal. On September 11, 1945, American occupation troops surrounded the Tojo residence. Neighbors gathered outside watching anxiously, because everyone knew what was about to happen. Inside the house, Katsuko and her family braced for the storm. When soldiers entered, Tojo attempted to take his own life with a pistol. He shot himself in the chest, but failed to die. American medics rushed in to save him. For Katsuko, that moment was the collapse of the world she had known. She was no longer the wife of Japan's most powerful leader. She was the wife of a fallen man, who was now a prisoner. He survived his wound and was taken away for trial. Katsuko's life instantly shifted from privilege to humiliation. Her neighbors, who once bowed with respect, now avoided her. The Tojo name was poisoned. Newspapers across Japan carried every detail of her husband's capture and trial. Katsuko had no choice but to endure the stares and whispers whenever she stepped outside. During the Tokyo trials, Tojo was one of the main defendants. The proceedings dragged on for 2 years, and during that time, Katsuko made visits to see him. For her, these visits were filled with dread and sadness. She knew her husband's fate was sealed, yet she remained loyal, standing by him until the very end. She never spoke against him, never sought to distance herself from his crimes, even though doing so might have made her life easier. On December 23, 1948, Hideki Tojo was hanged. That day, Katsuko was left alone with the weight of being Tojo's widow, a title that brought more scorn than sympathy. Unlike the imagined stories of starvation or suicide that surrounded other war leaders' families, Katsuko chose silence and survival. For the next 3 decades, she lived quietly, away from the public eye. She never remarried, never divorced Tojo, and never gave speeches about him. It was as if she had locked her pain away. She remained in Tokyo, surviving quietly, while Japan rebuilt itself into a new country. She then died in 1982 at the age of 91. By then, Japan had become an economic powerhouse, far removed from the ruins of 1945. Yet until her final day, she remained linked to the memory of her husband's choices. Her story was just the beginning. In another household, Kikuko Itagaki faced the same shadow of humiliation as her husband, General Seishiro Itagaki, stood trial. General Seishiro Itagaki was one of Japan's most senior military men during the war. He had served as war minister, and earlier he had played a key role in the invasion of China, especially in the campaigns in Manchuria during the 1930s. His decisions helped set the stage for years of bloodshed. After Japan's surrender, he was among the first major generals taken into custody. He was placed on trial at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, where his long career of military aggression was laid out in detail for the world to see. His wife, Kikuko Ogoshi Itagaki, had been with him since 1911 when they married. For more than 3 decades, she had lived the life of a military officer's wife, moving with him through assignments, raising their children, and keeping the home while his career advanced. By the time he became war minister, she was the wife of one of the most powerful generals in the Japanese army. But in 1945, all of that power and honor vanished. When Seishiro Itagaki was branded a war criminal, Kikuko's life was thrown into humiliation. Her name, once tied to prestige, now carried shame. Newspapers covered his trial, and the families of all the accused generals were spoken of harshly. People looked at their wives with suspicion, as if they shared the same guilt. Kikuko, like many others, had no public defense. She could not stop the whispers. She could not undo what her husband had done. In December 1948, her world collapsed when her husband was hanged in Sugamo prison. That night marked the final end of his role in Japan's history. But for Kikuko, it was the beginning of an endless shadow. Unlike some widows who made dramatic exits from life through suicide, Kikuko did not. And unlike the rumors that sometimes paint these women as broken and starving in the streets, there is no proof she suffered in that way. She lived on, carrying the invisible burden of being the wife of General Itagaki. Her children grew up marked by their father's name. In post-war Japan, children of condemned men often faced bullying and rejection. Classmates reminded them of their father's crimes, and employers hesitated to hire them. For Kikuko, watching her children struggle with that stigma must have been one of the deepest pains of her widowhood. After 1945, Kikuko herself seemed to vanish from public record. Unlike Katsuko Tojo, who lived into the 1980s, Kikuko left behind almost no trace. She did not write memoirs, she did not defend her husband, and she did not seek attention. Her silence became her story. Her final years are largely unknown, but what was certain is that she spent them in loneliness. She was tied forever to the memory of her husband's role in the war and his execution. While Kikuko's name survives in the record, the wife of General Kenji Doihara was nearly erased from history altogether. General Kenji Doihara was one of the most infamous figures in Japan's wartime history. Known as the Lawrence of Manchuria, he was a master spy who built vast intelligence networks across China. He was deeply involved in the creation of Manchukuo, the puppet state Japan set up in Manchuria, and he played a central role in Japan's control of occupied territories. His work made him powerful, feared, and hated. After Japan's surrender, Doihara's name was at the top of the Allies' list of war criminals. He was arrested and brought before the Tokyo Tribunal. Evidence showed his hand in drug trafficking, espionage, and brutal campaigns in China. By 1948, his fate was sealed. He was sentenced to death and hanged in Sugamo prison in December that year. His end was clear, but what remains striking is how little is known about the woman who shared his life. Unlike other generals whose wives' names and lives were at least recorded in some detail, Doihara's spouse almost disappeared from history. Some records suggest that he had a wife, but her name was never widely mentioned. There are no clear accounts of her reaction when her husband was arrested, nor of her life after his execution. She left behind no memoirs, no public statements, and no interviews. It is as if history erased her completely. Even as she faded from memory, others like Fumiko Matsui stepped into the public eye. Fumiko's husband, General Iwane Matsui, is remembered for one of the darkest chapters of the war, the Nanjing Massacre in 1937. During the tribunal, he was held responsible for the atrocities committed under his command, even though he argued that he had tried to control his troops. The court found him guilty, and like several other top leaders, he was sentenced to death and hanged in Sugamo prison. Fumiko had lived with him through the years of his rise in the army. She was there when he climbed the ranks, and she was there when everything collapsed after Japan's defeat. Unlike many other wives of condemned generals, Fumiko did not completely disappear from public life after her husband's execution. She carried the stigma of being the widow of a war criminal, but she also chose to find her voice in the company of others who shared the same fate. In the years that followed, Fumiko became active in the White Chrysanthemum Association, a group formed by the families of executed and imprisoned war leaders. The association gave widows a way to gather, mourn, and speak for themselves in a society that often shunned them. For women like Fumiko, it was not only about personal grief, but also about trying to defend the memory of their husbands who were condemned by the International Tribunal. She chose to stand among other widows, creating a community where they should share their burdens. It was not an easy role. Post-war Japan was a place where most people wanted to forget the past, rebuild the nation, and move forward. Yet Fumiko and the other members of the White Chrysanthemum Association reminded society of wounds that had not healed. Another widow, named Kanui Kimura, would go on to lead the White Chrysanthemum Association. Kanui was the wife of General Heitaro Kimura, who was one of the most senior commanders of the Japanese army during the war. In Burma, he oversaw the use of forced labor, including Allied prisoners of war who were made to work under brutal conditions. Thousands died from exhaustion, starvation, and disease along the railway project that became infamous as the Death Railway. After Japan's surrender, Kimura was arrested and brought before the Tokyo Tribunal. His role in these crimes was judged to be so severe that he was sentenced to death. Kanui carried the same shame of being tied to one of the condemned. Yet she did not disappear into silence and chose to step forward. Her name is clearly recorded in history as one of the most active war widows after 1945. Rather than allowing her husband's execution to erase her place in society, she worked to build a community for women in the same position, which was known as the White Chrysanthemum Association. She eventually rose to lead that association. Under her leadership, the group became not just a circle of grieving women, but a public presence in Japan. They gathered at memorials, cared for one another, and even worked to defend the honor of their executed husbands, arguing that the Tokyo trials had been unfair. Not every wife's story ended with the hangings of their husbands. Toyoko Oshima's life followed a different path. She was the wife of Hiroshi Oshima, one of Japan's most important diplomats during World War II. As ambassador to Nazi Germany, he had direct access to Adolf Hitler and other top Nazi leaders. He was deeply trusted by the German government, and his detailed reports back to Tokyo were so valuable that even American intelligence secretly intercepted and studied them. After the war, however, his position of influence turned into a burden. He was arrested, put on trial, and instead of a death sentence, faced life in prison for his role in supporting Japan's alliance with Germany. Toyoko shared much of this journey with him. She lived with him in Berlin during the war years, experiencing the tense and dangerous atmosphere of a city at the heart of Hitler's empire. As Allied bombing rage shook Berlin and the Red Army closed in, life became unbearable. In the spring of 1945, when the city was collapsing, Hiroshi made a choice to protect his wife. He sent Toyoko away to Austria, a safer place than Berlin in its final days. This decision likely saved her life, as Berlin soon fell into chaos under Soviet occupation. After Japan's surrender, Toyoko returned home. Unlike many widows whose husbands never came back, she still had a partner, even if he was locked away in prison. When Hiroshi was paroled in 1955 and later fully released in 1958, Toyoko and her children were able to reunite with him and live together again. For her, the war's end did not bring sudden widowhood or public disgrace of execution, but a long period of waiting, uncertainty, and finally quiet rebuilding. Life after the war was not easy for the Oshima family. Hiroshi's influence and high status were gone. Once a man who dined with Hitler and moved among the most powerful leaders in Europe, he returned home to an ordinary life with little recognition. For Toyoko, this meant adjusting from the life of a diplomat's wife to one of quiet survival in a defeated country. She did not seek the public eye or leadership as some widows did. Instead, she focused on keeping her family together and supporting her husband in the years he had left. Hiroshi Oshima lived until 1975, which meant Toyoko spent decades by his side after his release. Her experience was very different from the women whose husbands had been executed. She did not face the trauma of sudden loss, but rather the slower pain of watching her husband's power, reputation, and role in history fade into nothing. For her, the burden was not grief alone. It was the long shadow of a past that Japan wanted to forget, and the quiet work of holding a family together in that silence. Among all these wives, there were also some women who never lived to see their husband's final downfall. One example is Shizuko Hirota, the wife of Koki Hirota. Koki Hirota was a very unusual figure among the men punished after World War II. He was not a general or an army commander, but a diplomat, and later Japan's prime minister. Still, because he supported Japan's expansion into China and did not stop the military's brutality, he was found guilty at the Tokyo trials. In December 1948, he became the only civilian leader executed by hanging. Shizuko did not live long enough to see those final years. She had married Hirota in 1914 when he was still a rising diplomat, and for decades she shared the life of a politician's wife. Together they had 2 daughters, and during the 1930s when Hirota became foreign minister and later prime minister, she stood by him as Japan entered its most aggressive years. But in 1946, only a year after Japan's surrender, Shizuko died. This was before the trials had fully run their course. Because of this, she never had to watch her husband sit in the courtroom as prosecutors listed his failures and crimes. She never had to hear the sentence of death read aloud, and she was not there when he was led to the gallows. In a way, she was spared the most painful moments. The burden, instead, fell on their 2 daughters. They had to live with the knowledge that their father had been executed as a war criminal. In post-war Japan, that kind of legacy was very heavy. Families often faced whispers, discrimination, and the quiet judgment of neighbors. For the Hirota daughters, their mother's early death meant they faced these years without her support. Unlike Shizuko, some women felt the weight of defeat and shame too heavy to bear, that they ended their own lives. One of the clearest examples was the wife of Admiral Takijiro Onishi. He was called the father of the kamikaze because he oversaw the suicide missions that sent young pilots crashing into enemy ships. After Japan's surrender, Admiral Onishi performed ritual suicide at his home in Tokyo. His wife, unable to imagine living without him or carrying the shame of his actions, also chose death. But this was not an isolated case. In towns and villages across Japan, other wives of military officers and soldiers followed the same path. Some drank poison, believing it was the quickest way to escape disgrace. Others hanged themselves quietly in their homes, leaving behind children who suddenly became orphans. A few walked into rivers or the sea, a traditional act in Japan that symbolized returning to nature in death. Historians believe the exact number of these suicides will never be known. Many cases went unrecorded, especially in rural areas where families kept their tragedies private. The wives carried shame, but so did the children. Many sons and daughters of executed generals and ministers were denied entry to schools or jobs. Some changed their names to hide their connection. One of Hideki Tojo's sons, however, rose to become the president of Mitsubishi Motors decades later, showing how some families managed to climb back into respectability, but others never escaped the stain of their fathers' names. The suffering of wives often continued in their children, proving that the war's punishment lasted across generations.